A simple woman in jeans walks into a luxury car dealership just to ask about a birthday gift for her sister. But within minutes she's publicly humiliated, accused of not belonging, and kicked out. Less than 24 hours later, a Rolls-Royce Phantom arrives, and what happens next leaves the entire staff speechless. Stay with me, you won't believe the lesson this story teaches. Before we begin, drop a comment where you're watching from, and if this story hits you, don't forget to share it forward. It all started on an ordinary morning. Maggie Collins adjusted the strap of her canvas bag as she pushed open the glass doors of Boston Luxury Motors. The sun had barely lifted over the skyline, casting long beams of golden light onto the city sidewalks. A subtle breeze danced through her chestnut ponytail. She had parked 3 blocks away by choice, habit really. Despite everything, she still preferred walking. She liked feeling the city under her feet, the rhythm of the pavement, the blend of strangers' voices. She wore no makeup, not out of protest but preference. A soft white t-shirt clung to her frame, modest but clean. Her jeans were frayed at the hem, a testament to time rather than neglect. Her sneakers had long passed their prime, but carried her faithfully nonetheless. She wasn't here to make an impression. She was here for something simple, yet deeply meaningful, a birthday gift for her older sister, Caroline. Caroline had beaten breast cancer last year, and through every appointment, every grueling round of chemotherapy, Maggie had been there. They'd laughed in hospital corridors, cried on the porch of their childhood home, and whispered childhood memories during long, sleepless nights. So when Caroline mentioned in passing that her dream car was a midnight blue coupe she'd seen once on a magazine cover, sleek, elegant, but probably costs more than I'll ever make, Maggie made a silent promise. If she ever got the chance, she'd make that dream come true. And today was that day. As she stepped into the expansive dealership, a wave of air conditioning greeted her. The glass walls shimmered under the morning sun, showcasing an array of luxury vehicles that looked more like art pieces than machines. Each was positioned like royalty: Aston Martins, Ferraris, Bentleys, all polished to a high shine, their metal bodies gleaming with promise. The place smelled faintly of leather and new tires. She walked slowly, taking it all in. The showroom was quiet at this hour, with just a few staff members tidying brochures or sipping coffee from sleek ceramic cups. Her gaze landed on the car. There it was. Midnight blue, parked slightly elevated, framed in soft lights. It looked exactly like the one Caroline had described. Her heart fluttered. A young man in an oversized suit approached her, his smile tentative but kind. "Good morning, ma'am. Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors. I'm Daniel. Is there something specific you're interested in today?" Before she could speak, a sharper voice cut in. "I'll take it from here." Daniel, a tall man with slick back hair and a navy suit that fit like it was tailored in Milan, stepped forward. He exuded the kind of confidence that was more armor than aura. His name tag read Blake Thompson, sales manager. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't smile. Instead, he gave her a once-over, eyes flicking from her face to her jeans to her sneakers. A single brow arched slightly. "Looking for directions, ma'am?" he asked, his voice coated in courtesy, so thin it might snap at any moment. Maggie smiled, not offended but aware. "Actually, I was hoping to ask about that midnight blue coupe." She pointed. Blake followed her finger and let out a soft chuckle, dry, performative. "Ah, the Azure. Beautiful car. Limited edition. One of only 15 made this year. Priced at $285,000. He emphasized each syllable like he was describing a spaceship to a toddler. "Perhaps I can direct you to our used car division. They're about 3 blocks east." Behind him, another salesman stifled a laugh. Maggie paused, breathing in slowly. She had faced worse, far worse. Discrimination didn't rattle her anymore. But it did sting. Especially when it came dressed in silk ties and smiled through perfect teeth. "I'd still love to learn more about that model," she said, still soft, still kind. "Is it possible to see the interior?" Blake's jaw tightened. "The Azure is, by appointment only," he lied, hands clasped behind his back. "Our serious clients usually schedule private viewings." Just then a couple walked in. Designer sunglasses, leather shoes that hadn't seen a scuff, and the kind of relaxed entitlement that made Maggie invisible in their presence. Blake turned on his heels, smile blooming like a lily. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, what a pleasure," he gushed. "Let me show you something very special." Daniel stood awkwardly beside her, an apology flickering in his expression. "Would you still like me to tell you about the Azure?" he asked quietly. "I would," she said, thankful. He began to describe the specs, the hand-stitched leather, the twin-turbo V8 engine. Maggie listened, but her eyes followed Blake as he led the Harringtons right to the Azure. He opened the door with a flourish, gesturing like a magician revealing his final trick. The same car he'd just deemed inaccessible. "That's quite all right," she said gently to Daniel, the ache in her chest dull but present. "I understand how these things work." Blake's voice drifted across the room. "This model has a waiting list of 8 months, but I've set aside one just for you." Maggie stepped closer. "Excuse me," she said calmly. "I was hoping to inquire about purchasing this model." Blake froze. His smile twitched. "As I mentioned, this vehicle is being shown to these customers." "I'm specifically interested in this car," she repeated, "for my sister's birthday next month." His tone sharpened. "Look, I understand people like to dream," he said, keeping his voice low but laced with disdain. "But this is a place of business. That car costs more than most homes. You're interrupting a legitimate sale." A few customers nearby had turned to watch. Daniel hovered nervously, unsure of what to do. "I'm prepared to make a cash purchase today," Maggie said, still polite, still composed. Blake laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that echoed through the polished floor. "A cash purchase? Really?" His voice grew louder, just enough for others to hear. "This isn't a yard sale. People who can afford these cars don't dress like—" He stopped, waving vaguely at her outfit. Maggie's cheeks burned, not with shame, but with a restrained fury. Not for herself, but for every person who'd been judged for what they wore, where they came from, how they looked. "I believe my money is as good as anyone's," she said quietly. Blake stepped closer, towering above her now. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice ice. "You are wasting my time. Either make an appointment for a serious discussion, dressed appropriately, or please leave the premises." Silence fell across the showroom. "Is there a problem here?" A new voice entered the circle. Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, had arrived, lured by the tension in the air. "No problem," Blake said quickly, straightening his tie. "Just explaining to this lady that we operate by appointment only for serious buyers." Maggie looked at Mason. His eyes scanned her outfit, her shoes, her plain bag. She could see the decision forming in his gaze. "Miss?" he asked. "Collins," she replied. "Margaret Collins." "Well, Miss Collins," he said, voice diplomatic, "perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. Our clientele typically understand the exclusivity of our vehicles." "I understand perfectly," Maggie said, her voice unwavering. "Your sales manager has made your policies quite clear." Blake smiled faintly victorious. "If you're genuinely interested, which I doubt," he added, "perhaps bring proof of funds and dress the part. These cars," he gestured around, "are for a certain class of people." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Someone snickered. Maggie looked at the crowd, then back at Blake. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with quiet resolve. "I see," she said, turning without another word. As she pushed open the glass doors and stepped into the morning sunlight, the cool air felt like a balm against the sting of that humiliation. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number. A small, knowing smile curved her lips. They had no idea who she was. But tomorrow they would. Maggie sat quietly in the back seat of the town car, the soft hum of the engine barely audible over the quiet swirl of her thoughts. The city moved outside the tinted windows, a blur of brownstones, corner cafes, and people who had no idea that just an hour ago, she had been dismissed as invisible. She didn't cry. She rarely did. But something inside her twisted, a blend of anger, sadness, and a strange kind of ache. Not for herself. She could walk away, and she had. What she couldn't walk away from was the broader truth. People everywhere were treated like this every single day. Judged, shrugged off, looked at and looked past. And most of them couldn't do anything about it. The car slowed as it turned off a quiet road lined with maple trees. The Collins estate came into view, 5 acres of understated elegance nestled just outside the city. It wasn't the kind of wealth that shouted, it whispered, lived in details. Hand-carved stone pillars, low-sweeping architecture inspired by New England tradition, and wide, open windows that let the sun pour in like hope. Maggie had always insisted it feel like a home, not a fortress. Not because they couldn't afford grandeur, but because that wasn't who they were. As the driver opened her door, she stepped out slowly, the events of the morning still lingering on her skin like cold mist. Inside, the house was quiet. Classical music played faintly in the background, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the kitchen from one of the housekeeper's morning routines. She walked down the hall toward Alexander's study. Her footsteps were soft against the hardwood floor, but her presence was unmistakable. Before she could knock, the door opened. Alexander stood in the doorway, tall and lean, his salt and pepper hair slightly tousled from the morning breeze that filtered in through the open window behind him. He didn't smile, not yet. He didn't need to ask. 15 years of marriage had taught him how to read every line in her face. "What happened?" he asked gently, stepping aside to let her in. Maggie sank into the leather armchair across from his desk, running a hand down her thigh, as if trying to wipe off the remnants of the dealership. She looked around the room, so familiar, so comforting. Books lined the shelves, a sketch of their foundation's first community center hung on the wall. She found her voice slowly. "It was educational," she said at last, her smile tight and humorless. Alexander raised a brow. He knew that tone. He moved to the side table and poured her a glass of water before sitting across from her. "Start at the beginning," he said. She did. She told him everything, the showroom, the car, the look in Blake's eyes. How quickly his fake courtesy dissolved into open mockery. How every word had been dipped in condescension. How the others laughed. How even the owner stood by, watching silently as Maggie was told, in no uncertain terms, that she didn't belong. That she needed to dress the part. That she needed to understand her place. She paused at times, not because she didn't remember, but because the memory itself came laced with emotion she wasn't ready to spill. Alexander listened without interrupting. His hands were folded, but the tightness in his knuckles betrayed his calm. When she finished, she looked up. "It wasn't the first time something like this has happened," she said. "And it won't be the last." Alexander leaned forward. "You're right. But this time, it happened to the wrong woman." She smiled faintly. "I thought about walking away. I really did. Just finding the car somewhere else. Ordering it online, if I had to." "You still can," he offered. "But then I thought about that young man," she continued. "Daniel. He was respectful. Embarrassed, but not because I was there. Because of how I was treated. He tried to help, even when he was told to step aside. And I thought about all the other people who walk into places like that and get dismissed. And I realized, this isn't about revenge. It's about perspective." Alexander sat back in his chair, nodding slowly. "I don't want to punish anyone," she said. "But I want them to learn. I want them to understand what it feels like to be invisible in a place that was built to impress. I want them to feel what it's like to be seen not as who you are, but what you wear. I want Blake and that owner and everyone else in that showroom to remember that decency has nothing to do with net worth." There was a pause. Alexander steepled his fingers. "Then let's teach them," he said simply. Maggie looked at him. "Not in the way you think," she warned. "No buying the dealership. No firings. That's not the message. That's just spectacle." He grinned. "I wasn't going to buy the dealership." She raised an eyebrow. "Well," he amended, "I thought about it. Briefly." She laughed for the first time that day. "I want them to see," she said. "Not fear. See." Alexander leaned back, wheels already turning. "We could do that. A demonstration. Not about money, but about presence. Truth. Something that challenges their assumptions. They'll recognize me if I go back." "You won't be going," he said. Her brow furrowed. "I will." The words hung in the air like a spark waiting for ignition. Alexander Collins was known for many things. His breakthrough in renewable energy storage, his quiet philanthropy, his tendency to disappear into the background at formal events despite being one of the most powerful men in the country. But few knew just how deliberate that invisibility was. He never led with wealth. He led with thought. "If they respect the suit, let's give them a suit," he said. "Let them see what they really value." Maggie watched him, a strange warmth blooming in her chest. "This isn't about making them look foolish." "No," he said. "It's about making them reflect." They sat together in quiet solidarity. Outside, the breeze rustled the trees lining the property, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. "What are you thinking?" she asked after a moment. "I'll go in the morning," Alexander said. "No announcement. Just curiosity. And when the right moment comes, we'll give them the mirror they didn't know they needed." Maggie nodded. He stood and came around the desk, offering his hand. She took it, and he pulled her into a gentle embrace. "I'm sorry it happened," he whispered into her hair. "I'm not," she replied. "Not anymore." That night, they ate dinner together under the pergola in the backyard. The chef had prepared something elaborate, but neither of them paid much attention to the food. Their conversation drifted from the foundation's latest projects to memories of early days, when money was tight, but their vision was clear. They laughed. They remembered. And when the stars came out, Maggie rested her head against Alexander's shoulder and closed her eyes. Across the property, in the guest garage, a Rolls-Royce Phantom sat gleaming beneath soft lighting. Midnight blue. The same hue as the azure coupe in the showroom. It had been a wedding anniversary gift from Alexander years ago. Maggie had rarely ridden in it. She always said it felt too loud for a woman who preferred blending in. But tomorrow, it would say everything without a single word. At 7 a.m. the next day, Alexander stood in front of his full-length mirror. He wore a charcoal gray suit, custom-tailored, with cufflinks engraved with the initials MC, a small tribute to his wife. His shoes were hand-stitched Italian leather, his watch a vintage Patek Philippe. He looked like wealth, walked like authority, and yet carried the quietude of someone who had nothing left to prove. He stepped into the back seat of the Rolls-Royce, the driver closing the door behind him with white-gloved care. As the engine purred to life and the gates of the Collins estate swung open, Maggie watched from the balcony, a mug of tea in her hand. She didn't wave. He didn't look back. They didn't need to. What came next wasn't for them. It was for the world they still believed could change. Blake Thompson arrived at Boston Luxury Motors at precisely 9:13 a.m. The exact time he always did. Routine was everything to him. He liked predictability, control. He liked walking into the showroom when the scent of waxed leather and citrus floor cleaner still lingered in the air. He liked nodding at the receptionist without stopping, liked the tap of his shoes against the Italian tile, and especially liked the subtle way his staff straightened up when he walked past. It reinforced his belief that he was the center of this world, the one whose gaze mattered most. Yesterday's incident with the woman in jeans barely registered as more than an amusing anecdote. He had recounted it to his colleagues at the bar last night, over overpriced whiskey and low chuckles. She actually said, "I'll pay cash," he laughed. Wearing sneakers with holes in them, bless her heart. They laughed, too, not because it was particularly funny, but because Blake always positioned himself as the kind of man you wanted to agree with. It made things easier. Blake never wondered whether he was being cruel. He believed he was being efficient. By 9:45 a.m., he'd already briefed the team. 3 potential buyers were scheduled for private appointments, and he emphasized, again, the importance of qualifying prospects before wasting time. "We're not here to entertain dreamers," he said. "We're here to sell a lifestyle. Remember that." Daniel stood silently near the back of the group, his jaw clenched. He hadn't slept well. Something about the previous day still gnawed at him. He kept replaying Maggie's calm voice, her composed face, the quiet way she'd walked out. The laughter that had followed her exit tasted sour now. But Blake, of course, had moved on. At 10:17 a.m., the showroom fell into an odd silence. The kind of quiet that suggested something had disrupted the natural order. Blake glanced up from his iPad, and then followed the gaze of his staff toward the tall glass entrance. Outside, a car unlike anything currently in inventory had just glided to a stop. Even Blake, with his daily exposure to 7-figure vehicles, felt a jolt of curiosity. A Rolls-Royce Phantom. But not just any Phantom. This was the extended wheelbase custom-built, finished in a rare iridescent midnight blue that shifted color with the light. Blake had only ever seen that paint once before, at a private unveiling in Geneva. This car wasn't just expensive. It was personal. The engine cut. The chauffeur stepped out, dressed in a traditional black uniform and white gloves. He moved around with deliberate precision, opened the rear passenger door, and stood still. From the back stepped a man who redefined presence. Alexander Collins didn't rush. He didn't look around nervously or pause for approval. He simply existed in a way that made space for him. His tailored suit hung from his frame with exactitude. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his eyes, calm, focused, scanned the showroom with the quiet observation of someone used to walking into rooms where he set the tone, not the other way around. Blake moved first, fast and smooth like a predator. This was a whale. Possibly the kind of client who bought not 1 car, but 5. Maybe a collector. Maybe a CEO looking to outfit an executive fleet. "Sir, welcome to Boston Luxury Motors," Blake said, stepping forward with a well-practiced smile and extending his hand. "Blake Thompson, sales manager. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today." Alexander accepted the handshake, but his grip was firm and brief. "Alexander Collins." Blake's eyebrows twitched, recognition flickering across his features like a weak signal. The name tugged at something in the back of his mind, but he couldn't quite place it. I was hoping to inquire about a specific vehicle, Alexander said. The Azure Coupe. Midnight blue. Blake's smile grew wider. Ah yes. Beautiful machine. One of only 15 this year. A fine eye, Mr. Collins. We actually have one on the floor right now. If you'll follow me. I know where it is, Alexander said, his voice quiet but immovable. My wife was here yesterday, expressing interest in it. Blake faltered. Your wife? Alexander's expression remained unchanged. Margaret Collins. The blood drained from Blake's face. She was here yesterday, Alexander continued, his voice calm, almost too calm. Wearing jeans. A white t-shirt. Sneakers, I believe. I think one of our junior staff may have. No, Alexander said. You assisted her. Or rather, you refused to. Blake's composure cracked. He swallowed. Mr. Collins, if there was any misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding, said another voice, this one younger and more nervous. All heads turned. Daniel had stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. Miss Collins was very clear about the car she wanted. You dismissed her. Repeatedly. Because of how she looked. Blake's gaze turned icy. Daniel. But the damage was done. By now, Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, had emerged from his office, having sensed that something unusual was unfolding. He took in the scene, Alexander Collins, the stunned staff, and Blake's increasingly sweaty forehead. Is everything all right here? Richard asked. Mr. Mason, Alexander said, turning toward him. Thank you for joining us. I was just explaining to Mr. Thompson that my wife visited yesterday and was treated in a manner that, frankly, disgusts me. Richard's face fell. I was present briefly, but I wasn't aware. She was told she didn't belong, Alexander said. That she wasn't dressed appropriately. That this establishment was for a certain class of people. Gasps rippled through the room. A few staff members turned away. Others stared at the floor. I understand that mistakes happen, Alexander continued. But I don't believe this was a mistake. It was a reflection of values. Richard stammered. Mr. Collins, please, this is not who we are as a company. I assure you. Actions speak louder than mission statements, Alexander said flatly. Now, regarding the Azure, I had intended to purchase it for my sister-in-law, as Maggie planned. But I was also considering a fleet acquisition, 7 vehicles, for our foundation's new initiative. And perhaps an upgrade for our personal garage as well. Blake visibly perked up at that. But, Alexander said, turning back to him, I now find myself wondering if this is the right environment to conduct such a transaction. Silence. Pure and complete. Alexander let the weight of the moment sit before continuing. There is a way forward, but it will require more than a discount or a vague apology. Anything, Richard said quickly. Please, tell us what we can do. Alexander looked to Blake. The Collins Foundation is hosting a benefit gala next month. We're raising funds for a new adaptive sports facility for children with physical disabilities. Mr. Thompson, I think your presence there would be educational. Blake's mouth opened, then closed. As a guest? Alexander shook his head. As a volunteer. The humiliation was sharp, but the message was sharper. Alexander turned to Richard again. And perhaps your staff could benefit from training on unconscious bias. I'll provide recommendations. Of course, Richard said, nodding like a man who'd just been given a second chance at life. Finally, Alexander turned to Daniel. You were the only one who acted with integrity. I'd like you to handle the Azure transaction personally. Daniel blinked, stunned. Me? Yes. Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Alexander nodded once, then walked toward the car. He placed a hand gently on the hood, his voice quiet and proud. My wife has excellent taste, doesn't she? Blake stood frozen, the walls of his constructed world crumbling around him. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control. He wasn't admired. He wasn't even relevant. He was just a man being forced to reckon with the ugliness of who he had become. And the price of assuming worth could be measured by a suit. The door to the Collins estate closed with a soft click as Alexander stepped inside, the weight of the morning still fresh on his shoulders. He paused in the foyer, loosening his tie with one hand while the other grazed over the sleek marble of the entryway table. The house, serene and quiet, offered a sharp contrast to the tension that had simmered inside the dealership only an hour earlier. But even here, in the refuge of their home, something lingered, unsettled, unspoken. The world outside had just experienced a shockwave, yet Maggie hadn't been there to see it. And Alexander knew why. He found her in the sunroom, curled into the corner of the oversized linen couch, a book resting forgotten on her lap. The sunlight poured through the tall windows, framing her like a portrait. She looked up when he entered, her expression unreadable, her tea untouched. "Well?" she asked. Alexander sat across from her, elbows on knees, hands folded. He took a long breath before answering. "It went exactly as we expected," he said. "And nothing like they expected." Maggie watched him closely, searching his face for anything he hadn't said. "You told them?" "I did," he said. "I told them who you were, who you are. And I told them what they needed to hear, not what they wanted to." She looked away, nodding slowly. "How did he react?" "Blake?" Alexander asked. He turned a shade of gray I didn't know existed. Tried to deny it at first. Then Daniel stepped in. Maggie blinked, surprised. "Daniel?" "He backed your story. Every word. In front of his manager. In front of the owner. And everyone else." Maggie's hand came up to cover her mouth, not out of shock but something more tender. Hope, maybe. Quiet pride. "I offered him the sale," Alexander added. "Said I wanted him to handle the paperwork for the Azure." Maggie gave a small, content smile, and finally picked up her tea. "That boy's going to remember that moment for the rest of his life." "He should," Alexander said. "He earned it." They sat for a while in silence. Outside, birds flitted between branches, and the wind whispered through the hedges. Life, undisturbed, moved on. Maggie placed the cup on the table. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if it had been someone else," she said. "Someone who didn't have a husband who could roll up in a Rolls Royce and say, 'You made a mistake.' What if I hadn't been me?" "You mean, what if you weren't married to a billionaire?" Alexander asked softly. She nodded. "I think about the people who go through that kind of thing every day, who are made to feel small and powerless just because they don't look the part. People who carry their dignity in silence. And no one ever shows up for them." Alexander's brow furrowed. "That's why we did it. So they'd remember. So maybe, just maybe, they'd think twice next time." "I want it to matter beyond one dealership," she said. "Not just a gotcha moment. Not just poetic justice." Alexander leaned back, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Then maybe it's time to do more." Maggie's gaze sharpened. "What do you mean?" He stood, walking to the window, hands behind his back. "You said something yesterday that's been echoing in my head. About perspective. About teaching, not punishing. If we really want to make an impact, we have to do more than make a point. We have to build something." She stood too, moving to join him. "You're thinking of a campaign." "I'm thinking of a movement," he said. "Something that brings awareness to these silent humiliations people face every day. We've done it before, when we fought for inclusive playgrounds, when we built that adaptive tech lab in the Bronx. Why not take this on too?" Maggie exhaled, her eyes filling with something bright and painful and alive. "You're talking about human dignity as a right, not a reward." "Exactly," he said. "We start with a story. Your story. But we collect more. We invite others. We build a platform where people can speak. Be seen." Maggie looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment the years fell away, and she saw the man who had once sat beside her on the edge of a stage after a benefit dinner, talking about the shape of the world they still hoped to build. "This isn't about viral fame," she said. "It has to be honest. Raw. Messy. People have to see themselves in it." "They will," Alexander said. "Because it's already real. We just have to shine the light." She paused, her mind already whirring. "We call it, you never know." Alexander's brow arched. "Go on. You never know who you're talking to. What they've survived. What they carry. You never know who's behind the clothes, behind the silence. What if we made that the theme? Stories from every walk of life. Ordinary people. Extraordinary truths." His lips curved. "That's it." They spent the next several hours sketching ideas, outlining content, reaching out to team members who had helped them build their foundation's previous campaigns. They mapped a digital series, guest stories, anonymous submissions, partnerships with equity consultants and nonprofits, educational modules for companies, schools, organizations. The initial story, Maggie's encounter, would be the opening chapter. A short film. Real footage from the dealership, reenacted if necessary. A narration that wouldn't preach, just guide. Maggie's voice, steady and strong. That night, the team met in their home office, and the room hummed with energy. Creative directors, media consultants, social strategists, all aligned around the seed of an idea that had bloomed into something far bigger than a single act of discrimination. And still, through it all, Maggie never once considered herself a victim. Not because what happened hadn't hurt, but because she had the power to respond with purpose, not retaliation. As the house quieted again, long after everyone had left, Maggie walked to the balcony. The sky was clear, and the stars stretched endlessly above her. She thought of her sister, Caroline, and how excited she'd be when that midnight blue azure arrived with a note that simply read, "You deserve the world." She thought of the thousands of people who had stories like hers, but no voice to tell them. She thought of Daniel, of Blake, of the countless faces who had been in that showroom yesterday, some laughing, some uncomfortable, some silent, and she hoped they were thinking too. Alexander joined her on the balcony, sliding an arm around her waist. "Do you think it worked?" she asked softly. "I think it began," he said. She rested her head on his shoulder. "That's enough for tonight." He nodded. "And tomorrow we build." Below them, in the quiet shadows of the driveway, the phantom sat under the moonlight, polished and still. A symbol, yes, but also a challenge. Because the next time someone walked into a room and was met with judgment, the world might look a little different. And it would all have started with a woman in jeans who refused to leave quietly. The morning unfolded like a quiet prelude to something inevitable. It was a Saturday, Boston streets just beginning to hum with the slow crescendo of weekend life. At Boston Luxury Motors, the showroom was already a polished stage. The cars were arranged meticulously, light reflecting in sharp, intentional lines off their hoods. Coffee steamed in tall mugs across the reception desk, and Blake Thompson stood once again at the helm, commanding the space like a general preparing for victory. But this time, his shoulders were slightly tense. There was a lingering heaviness to his usual swagger, a stiffness in his smile. Though he had tried to sleep off the incident with Alexander Collins, his body had held onto it like unfinished business. He had stared at the ceiling the night before, recalling the precise tone in Alexander's voice, not raised, not aggressive, but laced with something far more dangerous, dignity reinforced with truth. That kind of composure could unravel a man like Blake, who had built his reputation on assumptions. He'd spent years mastering the art of reading people, how they dressed, how they walked, how they carried themselves. But yesterday had introduced a fatal error into his system, and it haunted him still. The staff was quieter than usual that morning. Even the junior salespeople, typically buzzing with the latest tech specs or commission rumors, moved with a hushed awareness. Daniel especially kept to himself. There had been a shift, subtle but seismic. Blake felt it in the air, but told himself it was temporary. A correction. A passing tremor in an otherwise unshakable world. At 11:03 a.m., the showroom doors opened again. Maggie Collins stepped in, this time not alone. She walked beside a young boy in a wheelchair, maybe 10, maybe 11. His legs folded neatly beneath a dark plaid blanket. He moved with ease, turning the wheels skillfully, eyes wide and curious. Behind them trailed another child, this one using crutches. A small group followed, diverse, joyful, and entirely unexpected. Several adults walked with them, volunteers, staff from the Collins Foundation, each of them smiling in quiet conversation. They weren't customers. Not today. They were guests. The dealership had been transformed. Large, freestanding signs bearing the Collins Foundation logo stood at various points across the showroom, detailing the vision for a new adaptive sports complex. Photos of children in action, wheelchair basketball, track events, swimming programs. A projection screen played a looping video featuring testimonials from families, volunteers, doctors. At the center of it all was a banner with 4 simple words in bold serif font. You never know. Blake stepped forward slowly, a mixture of confusion and apprehension coloring his features. "Good morning," Maggie said, her tone light but purposeful. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He hadn't expected her. "Not today. Not like this. We're hosting an awareness event here today," she continued, scanning the room like someone who already owned it. "With your manager's approval, of course. And thanks to Mr. Mason, this showroom is now a temporary welcome center for our cause." Richard Mason appeared behind Blake, slightly breathless. Yes, Miss Collins has been working with us all week. The idea is brilliant, really. Reaching a new audience, starting conversations where they normally don't happen." "Blake, I thought you knew." Blake blinked. "I must have missed the memo." Maggie smiled, but not with cruelty. It was the kind of smile that acknowledged what had passed but didn't linger on it. "We'll be giving tours, hosting a live Q&A with some of our youth athletes, and offering short test rides for those interested in understanding adaptive vehicle design." Blake looked around. Already, customers were mingling with guests. A woman in heels stood next to a boy explaining the mechanics of his basketball wheelchair. A couple observed a demonstration of hand-controlled driving systems installed in a specially modified car. It was an education, a reframing of perspective in real time. Maggie walked toward the center of the showroom, where a small platform had been set up. The microphone feedback squealed briefly as she approached it, then fell silent. All eyes turned to her. "When I was told I didn't belong here," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I thought about walking away. I could have. I have that privilege. But I also have a voice. And I realized that walking away meant others would keep being treated the same way, dismissed for how they look, what they wear, or what someone thinks they can afford." A hush fell. So instead of staying silent, we turned this into an opportunity. Because the truth is, you never know who's standing in front of you. You never know what they've overcome, what they're capable of, or what they're here to teach you. She gestured toward the group of children and teens behind her. These are some of the most powerful, driven individuals I've ever met. And not because they've been given less, but because they've done more with what they have. This is what the Collins Foundation is about. Building not just facilities, but futures. Not just access, but dignity. A ripple of applause spread across the room, not forced or polite, but warm, genuine. Blake stood still, hands at his sides, as something inside him cracked. It was subtle, invisible to most, but real. A part of him, the part that had laughed when she walked out, that had sneered at her sneakers, crumbled beneath the weight of what he saw now. A boy in a red jacket rolled up to him, stopping just inches from his polished dress shoes. "You ever played adaptive basketball?" the boy asked. Blake shook his head. "You should try," the boy said. "It's hard, but fun." Blake crouched slowly, for once meeting someone at eye level, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. "What's your name?" he asked. "Thomas." "Well, Thomas, would you teach me?" Thomas grinned. "Only if you promise not to fall out of the chair." "It happens." Blake laughed, a real sound this time, and nodded. "Deal." The rest of the day passed in a kind of soft transformation. Conversations bloomed where judgment once lived. Strangers exchanged stories. And Blake, who had once dismissed a woman because of her genes, found himself helping Thomas adjust the straps on his wheels, asking questions about the torque, the frame, the balance. By late afternoon, the event had drawn over 100 attendees. The showroom didn't look like a dealership anymore. It looked like a place where understanding had come to sit down and stay a while. Maggie found Blake near the refreshments table, where he was pouring lemonade for a young girl missing her left arm. "You've become quite the volunteer," she said. Blake looked up. "I didn't expect this." She nodded. "Neither did I." He paused. "I'm sorry, Maggie. I know I've said it before, but not like this. I was wrong. Deeply wrong. And I've been wrong for a long time." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked past him at Thomas, now challenging a customer to a racing duel in their wheelchairs. "Some lessons cost a lot," she said finally. "Pride, reputation, sales. But the ones that stick usually do." He looked down. "Worth every penny." Maggie smiled softly. "Good. Because you're not done yet." He raised an eyebrow. "We have 2 more events coming up." And Thomas asked if you'd be his partner for the next wheelchair race. Blake let out a low chuckle. "I guess I better start training." She extended her hand. He took it. And in that small gesture, something profound passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but an opening. A new beginning. As the sun dipped low and the event wound down, Blake looked around the showroom, so familiar, yet entirely new. The cars were still there. The wealth, the status symbols, the polish. But now, layered over it all, was something richer. Empathy. And once seen, it could never be unseen. The next few weeks moved like water, gentle at the surface, but with strong currents shifting beneath. Something had changed at Boston Luxury Motors. Not in the decor, not in the polished floors, or in the strategic placements of luxury vehicles that sparkled under glass ceilings, but in the way people moved through the space. In the way they looked at one another. In the things they no longer said, or could no longer get away with saying. Blake Thompson arrived earlier than usual these days. Not to check inventory or bark orders, but to check himself. He stood in front of the showroom mirror one morning, straightening the lapel of his tailored jacket, and for the first time in years, asked himself a question he never would have before. What do they see when I walk in? Not just as employees, not the customers, but the children, the families, the volunteers, the people who had shown up on that Saturday and changed the temperature of the entire room without raising a single voice. The You Never Know campaign had gained momentum fast, faster than anyone at the dealership could have anticipated. A local news station had picked up the story. Luxury car dealership hosts adaptive sports event after discrimination incident, now a partner in inclusion. The comments were overwhelming. Some praised the Collins Foundation's grace, others condemned Blake's original behavior. But a surprising number expressed something else entirely, a collective reckoning with their own assumptions, their own misjudgments, their own blind spots. Blake had become, unintentionally, a symbol of what happens when you fail to see. But he wasn't running from it. He was leaning in. It started small. He took Daniel to lunch and, for the first time, listened without interrupting. They didn't talk about sales strategies or closing techniques. They talked about people. Daniel told him about his mother, a nurse who had once been mistaken for a janitor by a patient's family simply because she wore scrubs and didn't speak with a polished accent. Blake had no clever response for that, only silence and eventually reflection. Then came the training sessions. With Maggie's help and the support of Richard Mason, the dealership began implementing an unconscious bias workshop for all staff, mandatory and recurring. Blake didn't just attend, he sat at the front, took notes, asked questions. At one session, when a facilitator spoke about invisible status, how wealth, intelligence, or experience often came in unassuming packages, Blake felt a lump rise in his throat. He thought of Maggie in that white t-shirt and scuffed sneakers, speaking softly but unwaveringly. Of Alexander Collins, dressed in a suit, revealing the weight of a truth Blake had been unprepared to carry. He carried it now, and it was heavy but not crushing. It was the kind of weight that grounded you. At the dealership, customers started to notice. There was a new atmosphere in the air, subtle but distinct. Staff were more attentive. Conversations weren't rushed. No one was prejudged by their attire. Even the showroom itself had evolved. One corner now held an accessibility display, curated by the Collins Foundation. It showcased adaptive vehicle modifications, photos of young athletes, and quotes from families who had benefited from the Foundation's programs. Blake often found himself standing in front of that display when he thought no one was watching. One afternoon, Maggie returned, not as a silent witness, but as a guest speaker. Richard had invited her to address the staff during an internal culture-building retreat. When she arrived, Blake was the first to greet her. "Miss Collins," he said, and then paused, correcting himself, "Maggie." She gave him a nod, respectful, without warmth, but not cold. They were no longer adversaries. But they weren't friends, not yet. What they shared now was something different. A contract of mutual understanding. During her talk, Maggie stood in front of 25 employees, some new, some veterans. She didn't use a microphone. She didn't need it. "I'm not here to retell what happened," she began. "You already know that story. What I want to talk about is what came after. The choice. Because every one of us has a moment, sometimes small, sometimes seismic, when we're asked to choose. Will I see what's right in front of me? Or will I look away?" She spoke about Caroline, her sister, and the Azure coupe that now sat in a small garage in the Massachusetts countryside, brought out only on Sundays for scenic drives and laughter. She spoke about the boy, Thomas, and how he taught Blake the rules of adaptive basketball, and how Blake had shown up for practices 3 times since. Maggie's voice lowered, gentle but firm. "What you believe about someone the first time you see them may be wrong. But what you choose to do once you know the truth, that defines you." At the end of the session, there was silence. Then applause. Then something else, a standing ovation, not because she had performed, but because she had revealed something people could not unsee. Afterward, Blake approached her again. "I still owe you," he said. "Probably more than you'll ever know." She tilted her head. "You don't owe me, Blake. You owe the next person who walks through those doors." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. 2 weeks later, something unexpected happened. Alexander returned. This time, it wasn't in a Phantom, but a modest black Range Rover. He wore jeans and a navy polo shirt. No fanfare. No chauffeur. Just a man arriving on a quiet afternoon to settle something. Blake was in the middle of reviewing inventory when the receptionist told him Mr. Collins was waiting. He stood up slowly, heart ticking louder than usual. Alexander extended his hand when Blake approached. "I hear you've been doing the work," he said simply. Blake nodded. "Trying. Learning." Alexander's gaze remained steady. "Good. Because I haven't forgotten about that fleet order I mentioned." Blake's eyes widened. "You're still considering. I'd like to move forward. But I want you to handle it. The words dropped like a stone into a still pond. Me? Blake asked. After everything? Because of everything, Alexander replied. You've changed. That matters to me. And to my wife. Blake didn't know what to say. His throat tightened again. You'll be working with Daniel too, Alexander added. He spoke highly of how you've mentored him since the event. It seems you've become someone worth learning from. The irony wasn't lost on Blake. For years, he'd taught others how to sell status. Now he was being trusted to deliver something more meaningful: respect, consistency, growth. I'll do it, he said. I'll make sure it's done right. Alexander smiled. That's all we ask. And just like that, the man who had once exposed his deepest failure now offered him a bridge. Later that evening, as Blake finished the paperwork, Daniel approached his desk. He told you? Daniel asked. Blake looked up. About the order? Yeah. Still can't believe it. I can, Daniel said. You've been different. Blake chuckled. Feels strange, doesn't it? All this growth. Daniel grinned. Terrifying. They both laughed. When the lights dimmed in the showroom and the last signature was penned, Blake leaned back and stared at the ceiling. He thought of Maggie, of the boy in the wheelchair, of the moment he dismissed a woman he now deeply admired. He thought of how fast it had all unraveled, and then how deliberately it had rebuilt him. He didn't know what tomorrow held. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: you never know who's standing in front of you. But if you're lucky, if you're honest, you just might find out who you really are. The grand ballroom of the Boston Harbor Hotel shimmered with candlelight, crystal, and understated elegance. It was the night of the Collins Foundation's annual benefit gala, a tradition that had grown from a modest dinner into one of the city's most anticipated philanthropic events. But this year was different. This year, the room was filled with a strange and beautiful blend of people. Wealthy donors in designer gowns and tuxedos mingled with teenagers in wheelchairs and children with walkers, their parents standing close by, nervous but honored to be there. The air pulsed with something that felt like gratitude and transformation. A celebration, yes, but also a reckoning. Near the stage, a 12-year-old girl with cerebral palsy practiced her speech with her therapist, mumbling words under her breath and laughing when she tripped over them. A young man with a prosthetic leg showed an older couple his award for adaptive track performance. And in the corner, adjusting a table centerpiece slightly askew, stood Blake Thompson, wearing a black dress shirt rolled at the sleeves, a lanyard that read Volunteer Logistics Team, and a look that was equal parts focused and humbled. He didn't wear a suit tonight. That had been Maggie's suggestion. Don't dress for the man you used to be, she'd said. Dress for the work. And he had listened. For weeks now, he'd been part of the planning committee, showing up for meetings, packing donation kits, organizing equipment transportation. He was still learning the names of all the children, but Thomas, bright-eyed, fiercely competitive Thomas, had already claimed him as a coach. They'd built a rapport over basketball drills and shared stories about awkward middle school moments. It had started with a race and evolved into a kind of friendship that neither had seen coming. As guests took their seats, Blake moved around the tables, offering bottles of water to the adaptive athletes seated alongside patrons who had donated 5- and 6-figure sums. No one looked uncomfortable. If they did, the children didn't notice. Or maybe they simply didn't care. The room wasn't built on pity or praise. It was rooted in possibility. At 7:15 p.m., the lights dimmed and a hush settled. Maggie stepped onto the stage, her floor-length sapphire gown falling in simple lines, her hair swept back. She stood behind the clear podium without notes. She didn't need them. Thank you all for being here, she began, voice steady but warm. Tonight, we celebrate not only the resilience of the young people we support, but the shift we've seen in how people show up. A shift in how we see each other. She paused, her eyes scanning the room until they landed briefly on Blake. He looked down, uncomfortable under the weight of her acknowledgement. You've probably heard by now, she continued, that this gala almost didn't look the way it does tonight. There was a moment a few months ago when I felt deeply invisible, at a place designed to dazzle. I walked into a dealership to buy a car for my sister, and walked out with a lesson I didn't ask for, but perhaps needed. And so did they. A few soft murmurs moved through the crowd. What followed wasn't revenge. It was something better. A conversation. An awakening. And tonight, some of the very people who once judged me by my clothes are here as volunteers, partners, and friends. The lights shifted to one side of the room. A spotlight landed on Blake. There were polite claps, but no cheers. And that was good. This wasn't a redemption arc for entertainment. This was real. Blake nodded once, then turned his attention back to a small boy next to him who was struggling to adjust his lap belt. Maggie smiled. "We raised over $2 million this quarter," she announced. "And every dollar will go into a project that's already under construction, an adaptive sports complex where kids like Thomas, Emma, Luis, and many more will play, train, and feel what it means to be unlimited." She stepped down to thunderous applause, but her heart beat slow and steady. She hadn't wanted to give that speech, but she knew it was necessary, not to celebrate a mistake being fixed, but to honor a world still capable of changing. After dinner, Blake helped guide the adaptive athletes to the photo area. Some posed in front of the large, you never know backdrop, others goofed around with the props, giant foam fingers, sparkly glasses, plastic medals. Thomas held up two-piece signs and leaned toward Blake. "Do I look cool or just like I'm trying too hard?" the boy asked. Blake grinned. "Cool. But don't let it go to your head. You're still terrible at free throws." "Lies," Thomas shot back, laughing. "I'm carrying our whole team." Nearby, Maggie watched the exchange, her arms crossed loosely. Alexander stood beside her, his glass of seltzer untouched. "He's changed," Alexander said. "He's changing," Maggie corrected gently. "It's a process." Alexander nodded. "You were right not to bury him." "I wasn't trying to be merciful," she said. "I was trying to be just. There's a difference." They stood in silence, taking in the room. A reporter hovered near the edge of the crowd, watching interactions carefully, her notepad ready. But tonight wasn't about headlines. It was about impact. An hour later, as the gala wound down, Blake stood by the door handing out small gift bags, each one containing a thank you note from a child and a photo of the future sports complex. Most guests smiled, offering kind words and quick handshakes. Then Maggie approached. "Long night," she said. "Good night," he replied. They stood for a moment, unsure of what to say next. "I didn't ask for a spotlight," Blake said. "Just so you know." "I know," she said. "But people needed to see it. Not you. The change." He looked at her directly. "I'm still not sure I deserve to be here." "Neither am I," she said with a wry smile. "That's what makes us human." They shook hands. And this time it wasn't formal. It was something else, earned. Just before midnight, the room emptied, the last of the volunteers packing up signs and unscrewing up lights. Blake sat on a low bench by the back wall, tying up a loose cord when Thomas rolled over to him again. "You're coming to practice this weekend, right?" the boy asked. "Wouldn't miss it," Blake replied. "I mean, you still suck," Thomas added. Blake laughed. "I'll take it." The boy grinned and wheeled away. In the stillness that followed, Blake leaned back against the wall, exhaling. He thought about all the days before that humiliating morning at the dealership, about how many people he must have misjudged, about how close he'd come to missing the point of everything, about the strange, poetic irony that it took being wrong, spectacularly, publicly wrong, for him to begin seeing clearly. And he thought about what Maggie had said, "You don't owe me. You owe the next person who walks through those doors." That person could be anyone. A parent, a student, a stranger in worn-out sneakers. The next Maggie Collins, perhaps. And when they arrived, he'd be ready. Not because he was perfect, but because now he saw. The sun was just beginning to crest over the harbor when the staff at Boston Luxury Motors unlocked the showroom doors. Light filtered through the massive glass windows, casting long, golden reflections across polished hoods and chrome trim. The dealership looked the same, sleek, immaculate, dripping with opulence, but something deeper had shifted in its foundation. It wasn't just a space to sell machines anymore. It had become something more nuanced, more human. Blake Thompson stood in front of the full-length glass wall that overlooked the city street. He wasn't in a suit. He hadn't worn one in weeks. Instead, a pressed navy button-down, no tie, sleeves rolled at the elbows, and soft leather shoes that no longer aimed to impress. His reflection looked back at him, older than he remembered, but steadier. He sipped his coffee and watched as the city stirred awake. Another day. Another chance. The dealership now bore quiet fingerprints of transformation. A new policy had been implemented. No assumptions based on appearance. Ever. The staff had undergone weeks of training on bias, empathy, and client experience, designed and delivered in part by the Collins Foundation and an external consultancy. The showroom now featured a rotating display from local nonprofits, causes the dealership actively supported. Where once had stood only luxury and exclusivity, now stood the soft assertion that status was not solely defined by wealth. And it wasn't performative. It wasn't PR. It was personal. Blake walked the showroom floor, nodding to each employee as he passed. Daniel was already working with a couple, his tone relaxed, engaging. A month ago, Blake might have judged them by their faded jeans and canvas backpack. Now, he only noticed the sincerity in their questions and the way Daniel listened without assumption. As Blake approached his office, he spotted a familiar figure stepping through the entrance. Alexander Collins. This time, he wasn't flanked by a chauffeur or arriving in a rare phantom. He was alone. A modest gray cashmere sweater over black slacks. Understated but unmistakable. Blake stepped forward immediately, extending his hand. "Mr. Collins." "Blake," Alexander said, shaking his hand. "I hope this isn't a bad time." "Not at all," Blake replied. "You're always welcome." They walked together toward a private consultation room, one Blake had recently repurposed. Gone were the ostentatious car posters and glossy catalogs. Now, soft lighting, minimalist decor, and a few black and white photographs of community projects decorated the space. Blake gestured for Alexander to take a seat. "I came to follow up on the fleet," Alexander began. "But that's only part of why I'm here." Blake nodded, attentive. "I wanted to thank you again for following through. For not just apologizing, but evolving. Not everyone does." Blake folded his hands. "It wasn't about proving something to you, or even to Maggie. I think, in a strange way, I needed to prove something to myself." Alexander nodded slowly. "So did I. When Maggie came home that day, she didn't ask me to avenge her. She asked me to listen. And then to help others listen. You did that." Blake smiled, a little worn, a little cautious. "I won't pretend I have it all figured out. Some days, I still catch myself making judgments too quickly. But now I see them as alarms. Warnings. Invitations to slow down." "That's all anyone can ask," Alexander replied. "Awareness doesn't make you perfect. It makes you accountable." They talked logistics for a while, vehicle specs, delivery timelines, corporate leasing options. But the heart of the meeting was already laid bare. By the time Alexander left, there was nothing left unsaid. An hour later, Blake joined the rest of the staff in the showroom. A few new customers had come in, and among them was a woman in a simple black blouse and a long denim skirt, walking slowly alongside her teenage son with Down syndrome. The boy's eyes lit up at the sight of a bright red convertible. "Wow," he whispered. Blake didn't hesitate. He approached gently, crouching so he was eye level with the boy. "You've got good taste," he said. "That one's got a V8 engine. You'd feel it in your chest when it roars." The boy grinned. His mother looked surprised but grateful. No salesman had approached them yet. Some still hesitated when things didn't fit the mold. Blake turned to her. "If you'd like, I can show you a few options. Some of our cars are easier to modify for additional support, depending on what you're looking for." She hesitated. "I don't know if we're ready to buy anything today. We were just looking." Blake smiled. "Everyone starts there. Let's take our time." He gestured toward the lounge area, offering them both seats and drinks before pulling a brochure designed specifically for families with special vehicle needs. It hadn't existed 2 months ago. Elsewhere in the dealership, Maggie had quietly entered. She hadn't announced herself. She didn't want a scene. She simply stood for a moment near the entrance, watching. She saw Blake speaking to the boy, not because she recognized his face, but because she recognized the posture. The sincerity. The absence of urgency to sell, and the presence of something gentler. Curiosity, maybe. Kindness. She turned to leave before anyone could notice. But Blake did. He spotted her just as she pushed open the door. He jogged forward, catching her just outside on the sidewalk. "Maggie," he called. She turned. "Blake." They stood in a brief, sunlit silence. "You came," he said. "I was in the neighborhood," she replied. "Curiosity." He smiled. "You could have stayed. I saw what I needed to." He nodded, stepping aside slightly, so he wasn't standing directly in her path. "The boy inside, his name's Micah. Reminds me of Thomas. First-time visitor. I think he's going to be a car guy." "Everyone's a car person at that age," she said with a soft laugh. Blake looked down, then back at her. "I don't think I ever thanked you." "You did." "No," he insisted. "Not for giving me a chance to learn, but for showing me what learning really looks like. It's not about facts. It's about seeing the world through someone else's eyes, even when it makes you uncomfortable." Maggie's expression shifted slightly, softer now. "That's not something I gave you, Blake. That's something you chose." He tilted his head. "Would you believe me if I said I'm still choosing it every day?" "I'd believe you," she said, "because I've seen the work." They stood again in silence, the kind that didn't demand more words. "I should go," she finally said. "Of course." She turned, but then paused, glancing over her shoulder. "By the way, Thomas wants to teach you how to shoot left-handed." Blake laughed. "I barely shoot right-handed. That's why he's excited." And then she was gone, her figure slipping into the crowd of Boston's morning foot traffic. Anonymous again, just another woman in jeans with somewhere to be. Blake returned to the showroom. Micah was laughing now, sitting in the red convertible, while Daniel snapped pictures on the boy's phone. Blake smiled. For years, he had chased status, precision, reputation. But now, he understood something he never had before. The truest measure of luxury wasn't the car or the cut of the suit. It was dignity. It was grace. It was treating people like they mattered, especially when no one important was watching. That was wealth. And in that moment, as he watched a child feel joy inside a car he'd only dreamed of, Blake Thompson realized he had never been richer in his life.